It's my pleasure to introduce to you Anna-Sophie Hobi. Anna-Sophie is PhD candidate at the Department of International Environment and Development Studies at the Norwegian University of Life Sciences. Her research focuses on the emerging lithium-ion battery industry and energy transition imaginaries in Norway. I'm very excited to hear more about it today. So it's great to have you. Please join me in warmly welcoming.
Thanks so much for a kind introduction. I'm really happy to be here and be able to present some of my PhD work actually in person at the Center for Energy Ethics. I'm here as a visiting PhD for a couple of months, so that's great. So I'm a fourth year PhD student, currently writing. So I'm going to present a bit about, I will talk about battery production in general and the energy transition in Norway. And I will talk a bit, especially about one of the chapters that I've written, which is about how the battery industry is imagined through industrial pasts. And I will try to put that chapter a bit more in the context of reindustrialization and energy transitions. And I will be mainly talking about my fieldwork in Southern Norway with a local government. So there's still a bit work to be done. It's a lot of work in progress still. I'm looking very much forward to also hear your comments and thoughts, and of course, hopefully answer some questions as well. And I want to start by introducing sort of the context around battery production in Norway a bit. So I did my fieldwork in a very lovely coastal town in southern Norway, which is called Arendal, where I did my fieldwork in 21-22 for 7 months. And the year before, in 2020, a startup company called Morrow Batteries announced that they are going to build a massive production site for lithium-ion batteries, primarily targeted to produce batteries for electric cars, with the intention to produce cells for up to 700,000 cars per year. So when I went to Arendal, the site looked primarily like this. There wasn't any factory yet. So they intended to build on an area which was 1 square kilometer big, where a tiny part, not a tiny part, but say around a fifth of that part was already leveled and graveled, as you can see in the picture here to the right. The rest of the area was mostly hills and forests, plus a waste management site as well. During the time of my fieldwork, the company was just about to establish an office in the town. And this is one example of very many examples across Europe, actually, to produce lithium-ion batteries. So since 2019 in Norway, 5 such huge plants were announced. So Gigafactories is a term that has become established since Tesla for large-scale manufacturing sites, especially for battery cells for electric cars. So in Norway, there were 5 of them. Some of them are a bit uncertain, as it commonly is with large projects. Some will develop, some will fade away again. And my fieldwork site was the one all the way in the south. And as you can see, there are also sites in other places, like in Sweden and Finland, where there is battery production taking place. And if we look at the whole of Europe, it would be a map with up to 60 different sites of planned, and maybe around 7 are already existing, and the rest is all planned battery factories. So the battery production is very much associated with energy transitions or transitions away from fossil fuels, and a decarbonization, especially in transport, because most of those battery projects are linked to producing battery cells for electric cars. That is the industry that demands the most batteries, and therefore kind of creates an emerging battery industry. But of course, such lithium-ion batteries are also used for a lot of other things, for ships, for larger vehicles, for machinery, and especially more recently also for storage of large-scale storage to balance renewable energy grids, which are less stable than, say, nuclear or gas-powered electricity. So that emerging industry is particularly tied to sort of decarbonization policies on one hand, but increasingly also part of a geopolitical tension that takes place between especially China, Europe, and the US, where supply chains become more and more strategic, particularly supply chains that are for a specific industrial sector, like the electro or the basically automotive industry in Europe, which is quite important. So there's a sort of race towards building up a large amount of battery production, or the whole battery value chain, includes from mining, processing to producing electric cars. So in that context is quite interesting in Norway to study, because Norway is on one hand the country that has been known to use a lot of electric cars. At the moment, it is 96% of all new cars that are being bought in Norway are electric or hybrid. So the adoption and generally environmental policies is something that Norway at least has promoted itself with. At the same time, it's a country that, for its own domestic energy use, primarily relies on hydropower. But Norway is interesting also because it is in a particular dilemma if we understand the energy transition, which the most dominant discourse around energy transition is the move away from exactly oil and gas industries, or to move away from fossil fuels. So Norway is Europe's largest oil and gas producer, and is very dependent on that sector for employment. There's around 500,000 employees in Norway that work in that sector directly and indirectly. And it also makes a big share of the state revenues, which finance the generous welfare state in Norway. But more than that, I think the oil and gas sector is very important because it's part of an identity, of a Norwegian identity. Because there's this strong narrative around that oil and gas has brought Norway, the poor country, into prosperity and a successful welfare state. And that is a story I heard quite a lot when living in Norway, and also by my interlocutors. It's a very common narrative. So that will mean a transition away from fossil fuels is not so much maybe about the everyday use of energy, but it's in fact tied to kind of identity, it's tied to the economy, and it's tied to the welfare state. So that gives it a particular challenge. Of course, the oil sector has been criticized, especially recently by young activists, and a more kind of, say, Green Party, left-wing, towards that we should phase out oil in Norway, or at some point maybe should phase out oil. But since the Russian-Ukraine war, that has been a criticism that has been toned down again a bit. So a question is a lot around what else can we do, but also what else can we also do in addition to oil and gas? And that brings me to the term reindustrialization, which is a term I've heard quite a lot during my fieldwork, especially amongst policymakers, politicians. And I want to give an example. When the Norwegian Minister for Trade and Industry was talking to the industry unions in their annual meeting in 2021, he was just installed in the new government, because after the election in 21, it changed from a conservative to a Labour government, Labour and Centre Party government. And he was a person that really wanted to show himself as a minister for the industry. And he vigorously proclaimed that we will reindustrialize Norway from south to north, from east to west. And he said that both as we, the country, we as you workers, and us, the government, will do that. And so his administration, and especially his ministry particularly, promoted new industries like hydrogen, like wind energy, offshore wind, and especially also battery production. He was even called the battery minister because he was strongly showing his support for this new industry. So I find the term reindustrialization quite interesting. It's not a term that is very often written about in sociology or anthropology of industry, actually, in comparison to industrialization or deindustrialization. And it's a term that generally just means expansion or the intention of an expansion of manufacturing and processing industries, which in Norway means primarily onshore industry compared to the petroleum industry. So the construction of new factories or plants. And I find that term stands in a very interesting contrast to when we typically speak about energy transition, because it's a term that kind of in itself is backwards oriented. It's oriented towards what has happened, and it assumes a previous industrialization and deindustrialization. So it's generally oriented towards the past. Whereas when we talk about transitions, at least in my understanding, is always forwards looking. It's always looking toward what is going to change, what is going to happen. So I find that there's a tension that exists in my research. So there's both forwards and backwards temporality, which I want to keep in mind now, returning to my field site. So here is a much nicer picture of Arendal, where I did my fieldwork. It's a coastal town of around 40, or a municipality of around 46,000 people at the southern coast, which is quite famous for being a perfect spot to spend your summer vacations, if you haven't planned yours yet. So I did my fieldwork mostly with the local government. So I had an office space in one of the local government, or which would be the council in Scotland, I would assume, with one of their office spaces, which was also shared with entrepreneurs and industry organizations. And I mostly followed the local government, which was heavily involved in actually planning and preparing for that factory. I participated, for example, in their planning meetings when they were discussing how do they prepare for such a big factory, which was expected to employ 2,500 people, which for the municipality then led to the expectation of this could lead up to 10,000 new people in our town. So there was quite a lot of preparation or planning work to be done with regards to, for example, housing, planning for infrastructure. They were expanding the port or they're still expanding the port actually. They were building supply of cooling water to the factory. And they were just generally also working with communication, how to communicate the battery project towards the citizens. And I think it's important to mention that a municipality has quite an important role in the Norwegian context, where so the Norwegian welfare state is quite a service-intensive state, where welfare means not only help to say the poor or the people in need, but welfare means a service to every citizen, actually. So a municipality is very present and is the main responsible for distributing and providing welfare to all citizens in Norway. So from healthcare and childcare to waste management and transport and ports and roads. And so in a way, a municipality is very present in people's lives generally. So in that context, with preparing for such a large industry, it is interesting that just how it actually became, the factory actually became located in Arendal was through a competition, through where 19 municipalities, including Arendal, were competing with applications of who will actually get that factory. At the time where the battery company had a few employees, but not even an office. So that competition was Arendal. Arendal had won half a year before I started my fieldwork. But I think what is super interesting with this example is that Arendal as a municipality went far beyond what is typically expected of a municipality to do. And I want to give 3 examples of them doing that. And one was that in the beginning, when the battery factory as a project was launched in 2020, it was the municipality that was the first one to actually produce, or indirectly, they hired the architecture company to produce 3D renderings of how they pictured the factory to look like. And it was the municipality who started promoting that image and went around to different municipalities, went around to conferences. So you had municipal workers who presented the battery industry and the battery demands and the need for a battery industry in the world to their neighboring municipalities, to their politicians across Norway, and actively promoting the battery industry as something that others should also support. In addition to that, they very early on, as a municipality, invested into the battery company that was just starting up, kept finding more funding. So they invested 10 million kroner, which is around 800,000 pounds. Yeah. And what I found particularly interesting to the time, autumn 2021, when I was in Arendal, is that first it all started with one factory, but then the municipality developed a sort of bigger vision of what Arendal can be. And that was a bigger battery hub, which not only hosts one actual factory, but a lot of supplying companies, material processes that could host recycling companies and so on. And that was a vision that really came out of the municipality and was kind of built up by the municipality, which would then transform an additional 2.5 square kilometers of forest area into industrial area, basically. And that was another of the renderings that the municipality produced for that. And I was always curious during my fieldwork, because compared to other industrial projects like renewable energy or generally wind energy and mining, which are very, very controversial in Norway, this was actually not so controversial. Or there were critical voices around it, of course, especially when it came to cutting down so much forest, so area planning. But generally, there seemed to be a broad consensus that this is actually something positive or good for Arendal. So that brought me to questions around why is an industry desirable? What makes an industry desirable? And how do people imagine an industry to be? So why particularly is the local government so involved in building up industry? And this, with again having the term reindustrialization in mind and the past, I think it reveals quite a lot if we look at how especially local government workers had used references to past industries, as they did quite frequently. They used histories of past industrial booms, particularly the industrialization period of Norway with hydropower, but also the oil boom that came after they found oil in 1969. They used those references to historical figures quite a lot when they were talking about the battery industry. And that topic was part of that one chapter, which I will present a few examples now. So one particular event during my fieldwork I found quite interesting, where especially those historical figures were used a lot. And that is when Arendal municipality often held public meetings. At the time, it was half COVID times, so it was typically online. So there was a municipal meeting where they would just inform the citizens about what is going on, what is the progress of the battery factory, what is the municipality doing in preparation. So there was one local government worker who was working for the business department, and he was just explaining what they were doing and the vision they had for Arendal with the battery industry. And he concluded his PowerPoint presentation with the words which said, "Can we do this?" ? And he showed two pictures of two men. One of them, the one on the left, is a well-known industrialist in Norway. He built up industry in the 1900s, so early 20th century. And the other one is a famous politician from Stavanger at the time of the oil boom. So he said, the municipal worker said, I quote, "Sam Eide," so the person on the left, "Sam Eide, he accomplished the impossible." And on the right side, Arne Rettedal. He was the mayor of Stavanger when Norway found oil. So the question is, are we in Arendal prepared to take the opportunity that is before us now? We are there now, where Stavanger was then. So he made the comparison to Arendal being at the same position or the same state as Stavanger, the oil capital, was when Norway just found oil, just awaiting a massive boom. And he referred to Sam Eide, who was a well-known industrialist. And especially these two historical figures, and even more so the histories they represent, were very present in my fieldwork when my interlocutors were talking about the battery industry. So it came up in all kinds of settings, anything from planning meetings to workshops to public interviews and speeches. Those references to the past came up a lot. So a bit more on Sam Eide. So he was actually originally from the same place, from Arendal, and he became really the iconic figure of the Norwegian industrialization with hydropower. He was an engineer, and he was the founder of some of the most important companies that still exist in Norway, like Hydro, that produces aluminium. And he built up also industry close to Arendal itself, and he was involved in building up several of the big hydropower plants, which became quite the hydropower was the kind of basis for industrialization in Norway. So he was very present as a figure, and even more so as a name. For example, in this picture, which is where I had my office space, so in this municipal office space shared with entrepreneurs, he was on the wall. But he was also very present when it came to the battery industry. For example, when I showed you the first site, this site was actually officially named Eide Energy Park, named after him. And then the vision of this bigger battery hub was called Eide Material Park. And then the accommodation barracks for workers today, building up the first factory, is called Eide House. And the battery modules, the huge giga modules of the different factories, are called Eide 1, 2, and 3, and so on. So the sort of references made to him were everywhere. And often interlocutors will compare sort of the glory days of industry at his time with which brought wealth and built up a nation, really, with the battery industry today. So one of my interlocutors said, this is how they built industry then, and we are doing the same now. And someone else said, we are in an industrial revolution right now with the battery industry. So Sam Eide was really this iconic, heroic figure that was often used to compare the battery industry. Sort of as an industry, what an industry should do is to do something for something bigger. So industrialist at that time was not only building industry for himself, so the story, but actually for a whole nation to thrive. And that's something the battery industry should also do. And what is often connected to that time is a term that kind of encompasses that very much, and that is the term industrial adventure. It is a term that in Norwegian is industri-eventyr, which both translates into fairy tale and also adventure. And that term was often used for the battery industry, that the battery industry is an industrial adventure or is going to lead to one. And that is a term that goes back to exactly that time of Sam-Eide, to the early 20th century, where industrialization and hydropower were strongly connected to building up a Norwegian nation at the time when Norway was eventually independent as a country away from the union with Sweden. So there's a sort of folklorization of industry taking place at that time. And there was a famous painter that contributed to that massively called Theodor Kittelsen. And he was famous for illustrating folk tales in Norway, which you can see a picture of in the middle and the top left. And in 1907, he was hired to paint pictures of some Eide's industries, so hydropower plants and electrochemical industries. And he translated those industries into the same kind of fairy tale vocabulary. And still today, the word industrial adventures is very commonly used, and the description of taming the waterfalls. So the heroes of the folk tales would tame the waterfalls to build a nation with hydropower. So there's a motif that is still very much used. And in a similar way, the term is also used for talking about oil and the oil boom. So Norway found oil in 69, which led particularly in the city of Stavanger, but in the whole country as well to an economic boom. And that is often called the oil adventure. And again, many of my interlocutors would not contrast the battery industry so much to the oil industry, but rather talk about how the battery industry and the oil industry are actually quite similar. And actually the battery industry would do the same, namely bring prosperity and welfare to the state again. And I found one example very, very catching in a way when I was in a planning meeting listening to municipal workers discussing their area planning. One of the municipal employees exclaimed that this is the oil adventure all over again. But she was just referring to the size of the tasks they had ahead as a municipality, and also the difficulties or kind of both challenges at the same time, excitement around preparing for a new industry, which was similar. So I found, especially with oil, that a lot of comparisons to the battery industry were about tackling challenges. So there was kind of an admiration for people like Arne Rettedal, who at the time tackled a lot of difficulties and uncertainties with a completely new industry to Norway, and made it an industry that benefited every Norwegian citizen. So that is a kind of a aspiration they had for the battery industry as well. If we act or do the right thing, this will benefit everyone. And I think it's quite interesting to look at those histories and the narratives of the past, because they kind of reveal something about the ethical kind of, or the ethical qualities and actions that is expected from the batteries industry, but also from themselves as local governments or local authorities to act in a way that it benefits the broader society and not only specific investors. So an industry is supposed to contribute to the Norwegian welfare state. So it's a sort of narrative or kind of imaginary that gives also trust in a new industry, that we've done this before and we've done it right. So this is going to go the same way. Of course, these industrial pasts are very selective histories. They're the good part of those histories, and they exclude a lot of maybe the more negative aspects like pollution with industrialization, the destruction of a lot of nature areas, and the lives taken away, for example, through accidents in the oil industry in the early days. So these are mostly excluded, but if they were included, they were more presented as things that they just had to tackle to reach to something better. So to reach to that the oil industry actually becomes a success for the country. So to conclude, here is what the factory looked last year. Today it's almost finished. The first one is only the first one. So to conclude, I think it's worth giving attention to local government workers because they reveal a bit more about, or something else about the energy transition. And I think what local government workers did in this case is that they translated broader or global economic development and technological change into local and or national visions. So they translated the battery demand into a national and local project. So they embedded it locally. And they made the energy transition as a reindustrialization, not only a solution to continue profit or economic growth, but they tied it directly to their main purpose, that is to provide welfare and to make it a moral ambition to actually build up industry. So thereby, reindustrialization becomes a very legitimate project, which links a transition with a continuity of welfare and prosperity. So it makes kind of an energy transition feasible and socially acceptable, and balances this transition with the continuity of the everyday comfort of a welfare state, much more than say a radical transition. So yes, with these thoughts, I'm going to end my presentation, and I look forward to your comments and questions. Thank you.